When we think of Bette Laethem Hartley, most of us think of a loving mom. With 8 children, family was always a priority. It had to be. But raising children wasn't work for Bette. Her family was her passion, and it showed in her always welcoming, mile-wide smile, in that infectious laughter you could hear from outside the house, in her unconditional acceptance of her children, no matter what they'd gotten themselves into. Her husband Joe asked her one time if she had any regrets about having such a large family. Bette said she would do it all over in a minute. She loved each of her children as babies, and she loves each of them as adults. Outside of the family, Bette's interests have always been simple, but she wove a complex patchwork of friends and experiences over her 80 years. Her farming roots. Bette Laethem was born in Detroit on September 7, 1924. She is the daughter of Emil Laethem Sr. and Marie Miller. The Laethems and the Millers were farmers. Marie lived on land at 12 Mile and Van Dyke. Emil Sr. was born on a farm at 7 Mile and Gratiot in Detroit. The Laethem family moved from Detroit to Halfway, which later became East Detroit and subsequently East Point. Emil Sr. was a milkman with Seal Test Creamery in Detroit. Bette had 3 brothers and 1 sister, Emil, Bob, Fred, and Virginia. They attended St. Veronica School from the 1st through the 8th grades. Bette and Emil are the only surviving children. Bette's mother Marie died young in 1945 of leukemia. She never had the pleasure of seeing her children get married or meeting her grandchildren. Emil Sr. died in a nursing home at 10 Mile and Hoover, property once owned and farmed by the Laethem family. He wasn't aware of it at the time of his death, but it is almost as though fate had sent him home to die. Urban sprawl claimed all the family land. The Millers' farm is now a subdivision, and the Laethems is a shopping center. Coming of age. Bette attended East Detroit High School and graduated in 1943. She was active in school. Bette was a cheerleader and enjoyed sports, especially wrestling. Her brother was a star wrestler, and she went to all his matches with her mother, who also loved the sport. Bette was very ambitious. She provided for all of her needs, bought all her own clothing and other things that a young girl needed. After graduating, she worked as a car hop at a drive-in dairy bar. She also worked at other restaurants, usually as a waitress. In 1945, she worked at Bunding Tubing Company. There, she made parachute ribs for the war effort. These ribs were used for the small parachutes that opened the main chute. She later went to work at Westinghouse Manufacturing at 9 Mile and Van Dyke in Warren. There, she was a courier, delivering intershop correspondence by bicycle. She laughed about how those old guys used to whistle at her as she drove by. Grandpa Hartley and Bette's uncle Herbert Payne worked there at the same time. Bette didn't know Grandpa Hartley at this time, but she remembered Uncle Herbert, who worked in the tool crib. Bette's next job was at the Chrysler tank plant in the office doing payroll. While Bette was working at the tank plant, she met Teresa Smith. They became close friends. Joe had a buddy named Art Cervoni who lived in Roseville. They used to run around together. Art worked at Square D Electric in Detroit. He called Joe one night and said that the shop was having a party. Art asked Joe to bring some girls to the party. Joe had known Teresa from childhood, so he called her and asked if she would come and bring a few girls to the party. A few days later, Teresa called and said she had 6 girls who wanted to come. She asked Joe if that was okay. Well, naturally, he said yes. They agreed to meet in Roseville, at the corner of Gratiot and Utica. Teresa introduced the girls, most of whom Joe already knew. They boarded a bus and proceeded to 8 Mile Road, where they switched to a streetcar. At the party, the crowd was socializing and having a good time. But then Joe noticed a beautiful girl sitting alone and looking sad. It was Bette. He asked her why she wasn't mingling. She started to cry. Her family had just received a telegram from the War Department. Her brother Emil, a tail gunner on a B-24 bomber, had been shot down over Yugoslavia. She didn't know if anyone on his plane had survived. Joe tried to comfort her. Everything would be okay, he told her. Emil would make it back. He then got beers for them, and they spent the rest of the party talking. Joe fell in love with Bette that night, but he didn't think he had a chance with her. She was 2.5 years older than him. She was 19, Joe was 17. He called her the next day, and they started going out, but never alone. They always went with the girls from the party and their boyfriends. After 3 months of this, Joe asked her to go out alone. Bette said yes, still unaware that Joe was so much younger. He finally told her, and she said that it didn't make any difference. She was in love with him. They went to the movies on their first date alone. A time to mourn and a time to dance. One day, Joe received the heartbreaking call that Bette's mother had died. He called Bette and asked what he could do. She wanted Joe by her side immediately after the funeral. They wanted to marry, but continued dating to be respectful of the mourning process. Then one night, they were at Bette's father's bar having a few drinks. Joe got up enough nerve to ask her father for her hand in marriage. Grandpa, yes, and he asked them when. He didn't think they needed to wait, and so Joe and Bette set September 1, 1945 as their wedding day. Bette was 20 and a half and Joe was 18. They were married at St. Veronica's Church in East Detroit. They had a reception at the American Legion Post in East Detroit. Bette's aunts cooked and served the food. The couple ducked out of the reception at 11 o'clock. They went to their little rented house in Roseville, and Joe carried his beautiful bride over the threshold. They lived in that little house for 7 years. With 4 children and 1 on the way, they decided it was time for a bigger home. Only problem, they had no money. But times and people were a little different back in the summer of 1952. A Mr. John Major from East Detroit called them. He said he heard they were looking for a home, and he had some to show them in East Detroit. They met with him, looked at a few homes, and came to the house in East Detroit. It was a duplex, and they could occupy the entire house. They told him that they wanted it, but didn't have any money for a down payment. John Major talked to the owner, who agreed to take that little house in Roseville as a down payment. They lived at that home in East Detroit for many years, until most of their children had married and left home. When it was time to look for something smaller, they looked no farther than the lot next door. They bought it and built a nice brick home on that lot. They lived there until Memorial Day 1990. As the era of working and raising children ended and retirement kicked in, Bette and Joe headed to Johannesburg and Gaylord to fulfill their dream of living in the North. They've been there for 14 years, and they have loved every minute of it. Girls just want to have fun. Bette has always found joy and laughter in life. Some of her most memorable times were simple times spent doing simple things with the people she loved the most. Sometime in 1943, before Bette met Joe, she and Teresa Smith, who later married her brother Emil, spent a week at a dude ranch called the Jack and Jill Ranch. This was in Montague, near Ludington. Bette enjoyed it so much that she returned for another week the following summer with her girlfriends from high school, Winnie Ostrander and Millie Hall. Bette reminisced about the Jack and Jill Ranch for years. Finally, she and Joe got to go there together. They were at an